World War II veterans. So this is the oral history program that Edward's talking about. Have you been interviewed by us at all?
I'm Education Coordinator with the New York State Office of General Services. Together with the New York State Division of Military and Naval Affairs, the New York State Division of Veterans Affairs, and the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, we are very pleased to bring you the last of this week's series of films and lectures to help celebrate the dedication of New York's World War II Memorial. Assembled here today is a distinguished group of 8 World War II veterans who are going to recall their experiences in an oral history panel discussion. This is a rare opportunity to learn history from the people who had a hand in making it. We anticipate this event to last anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half, depending on how long, how many great discussions are going to arise. Afterwards, to cap off World War II Remembrance Week, step over to the plaza, I think the thunderstorm has passed by now, to see Doc Scatlin and his 23-piece Imperial Palms Orchestra. They're going to entertain us with a USO-style extravaganza concert. And now, to introduce our panelists and to serve as moderator for this event is Michael Aikey, Director of the New York State Military Museum and Veterans Research Center. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Well, I'd like to welcome you all to today's panel. I am Michael Aikey, the Director of the New York State Military Museum and Veterans Research Center. One of my favorite programs that we run is a New York State Oral History program. And we are able to go across the state and interview veterans, primarily World War II veterans at this point. And I tell you, it's been a wonderful experience. I have found it very interesting and very gratifying. One of the things about this program is it puts your life in perspective. If you've had a lousy day, things are not going well, then you go interview someone like Mr. Gordon, who was a young man on the Bataan Death March, and all of a sudden my troubles and worries just evaporate. And I'd like to thank you all for coming and sharing this experience with us. Let me first introduce the panel. Starting to my left is Lieutenant Colonel Clarence Dart. Colonel Dart was a member of the elite Tuskegee Airmen, a group of African-American flyers. Most of you have seen the movie, and it was a great movie. Colonel Dart flew in North Africa, and he was later stationed in southern Italy. He flew 45 missions with the 12th Air Force, was shot down twice, and flew 50 missions with the 15th Air Force. Colonel Dart was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and 2 Presidential Unit citations. If we're lucky, he'll tell us about the day he almost got his MiG-262. I'm sure he remembers. It was a ME-262. And next we have Colonel John Edwards, a veteran of World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. During World War II, Colonel Edwards was a flyer in the 8th Air Force. He flew in a B-24 Liberator. On his 24th mission, this young airman was shot down over Germany and became a prisoner of war. Colonel Edwards is past commander of the American Ex-Prisoners of War, and he currently serves as president of the New York State Military Heritage Institute, which I suggest you all look into joining. To the left of Colonel Edwards is Mr. Paul Elisha. Mr. Elisha served in the U.S. Army Signal Corps. He received specialized training with Colonel James Roosevelt's Marine Raiders and was a member of the 75th Joint Assault Signal Company. Paul was on quite a few initial landings, and he was generally in the first wave. They hit the beach first to establish communications. He was awarded a Purple Heart for combat on Leyte, and his unit received a presidential citation after their involvement in Macon and Kwajalein Atoll assaults. You probably have heard Paul on WAMC as a wonderful program there. And next is Major Richard M. Gordon. Major Gordon was in the Philippines when the war began and was on Bataan when surrendered to the Japanese. He was on the infamous Bataan Death March. He wrote a book on the subject. He was also instrumental in the construction of the Camp O'Donnell Memorial Monument in the Philippines, commemorating Bataan survivors and members. We also have Mrs. Miriam Jaffe. She was a pharmacist mate, U.S. Navy, second class in the Philadelphia Naval Hospital. There she worked in the amputee ward and later transferred to serology and urinalysis. Mrs. Jaffe is very active in Veterans Affairs, including serving on the Albany Joint Veterans Committee, representative for the Jewish War Veterans in Albany VA Hospital, and current National VA/VS Officer of the Jewish War Veterans. Then we have Lieutenant Colonel Francis M. Liberty. Colonel Liberty enlisted in the United States Army Nurses Corps after graduating as a registered nurse from the Champlain Valley Hospital Nursing School. During World War II, she was a surgical nurse stationed in Rome, Italy, and North Africa. Lieutenant Colonel Liberty went on to care for wounded during the Korean War, was a nurse administrator during the Vietnam War. She earned a BS in nursing and MA in philosophy. And we have Ms. Shirley B. Lewis. Ms. Lewis served in the U.S. Marine Corps Women's Reserve, joined on June 26, 1943. She was assigned to the U.S. Marine Corps headquarters in Arlington, Virginia, and worked in the Plans and Policies Division, the Office of the Commandant. For 18 months, Ms. Lewis was the secretary to 5 of the aides to the Commandant, covering artillery, tank, paratroopers, and communications. Ms. Lewis was the first woman to be sent to radio communications school in the Marine Corps in San Diego. After graduation, she was assigned to the communications section at the Marine Corps Air Station in Hawaii, discharged November 1945. And finally, we have Mr. Thomas Scheisel. He joined the Merchant Marine Service in 1943. His first assignment was on a galley. He was a galley utility man on a tanker that refueled Navy ships engaged in the New Guinea campaign. After graduating from Radio Officers Training School as a warrant officer, he was assigned to T2 tanker as a second radio officer. He sailed in convoys around North Africa, Italy, England, and Scotland. He ended his merchant marine career as a chief radio officer and sailed over 250,000 miles during the war. Well, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. One of the first questions I generally ask in an interview, and we can start with Colonel Dart. Do you remember, where were you and what were you thinking about when you heard about Pearl Harbor?
Well, that particular day I was singing with our church choir on a program to raise funds for what we had in my hometown called the Arctic League. It was a nonprofit and provided a lot of Christmas gifts similar to the Salvation Army. And our particular part of the program was stopped because somebody came running in. Oh, they just bombed Pearl Harbor. And for a while, nobody knew what they were talking about. But that's where I was on that particular day. I was, I think I was 21 years old at the time.
Colonel Edwards?
Experience on Sunday, when we heard the news, we were all at home, the family was together, And through the scratchy radio that we had those days, we got word that there was an attack on Pearl Harbor. And I found, Pearl Harbor, where's Pearl Harbor? What is the full meaning? So it was a question of what it was all about, what did it mean? And then later in the news, more information was received, and we finally realized that we were at war then.
Paul?
I still remember it pretty vividly. I was sitting in the living room listening to the New York Philharmonic Sunday broadcast, and they interrupted the broadcast with a brief bulletin that Pearl Harbor had been bombed. When the second bulletin with more details came in, I went running outside, and my best buddy who lived next door came running outside. We talked for 15 minutes and headed for the bus stop and the nearest Army recruiter who turned us down because we were both under 21. And we both began a campaign to get our parents to change their minds about allowing us. And 6 months later, I did convince my father to.
Now, Major Gordon, you were probably the closest to Pearl Harbor at...
Yeah, I'm probably the only man in the room who was there when it happened, in the sense of being where I was at anyway. When we learned of Pearl Harbor, it came over the radio, and the very first thing we had to do was go outside and dig holes. And we didn't have too much time, by the way. And in the interim period between the time the Japanese struck us, which was 8 hours after Pearl Harbor, we were chasing so-called leads on Japanese paratroopers dropping on Luzon Island, most of which had been just that, rumors. But they sent us all over the place looking for them. So that was my Pearl Harbor day.
What went through your mind when you heard the Japanese had done this?
We said, we're in trouble.
You're a long way from home.
Yeah, we're in trouble. Because we knew what we had over there and it wasn't that much.
So you're at that point, you're basically buying time.
Basically doing?
Buying time.
Oh yeah. I think if you check the history of the first day of war, there was no people more shocked than we in the Philippines. We never expected to be hit there.
Really?
No, we felt that they would go anywhere else. Well, the Philippines was a target for Japan. We didn't think it'd be the first target, and it really was the first target.
Mrs. Jaffe?
I was at home with my family, and we were very concerned because my brother had already been inducted into the Army and was in the Army for right after the first all of a sudden I can't say it. When they pulled all the numbers out for
Selective service, the draft.
He was number 30, and he finished the end of his school year at college, and he went into service then. And we were really very frightened because my brother was already in service.
Ms. Lewis?
Well, my dad had just opened a service station on the Taconic Parkway. I graduated from high school in 1940, and I was taking out his supper in 1941 when they hit Pearl Harbor. And all my street, all the girls and boys enlisted right away, and I couldn't because I wasn't 20 yet. I had to wait. So I waited till May. I was 20, May 23rd, and then I went in the Marine Corps. Don't ask me why I went in the Marine Corps. I really don't know. I never saw the uniform, so it wasn't that. But I'm glad I did.
Colonel Liberty?
I was on duty on a ward in Champlain Valley Hospital. I was still a student nurse. And I remember a patient looking at me and saying, "Oh my God, we're in trouble." And he started to cry. And that's all I remember.
Okay. Mr. Scheisel?
My memories are a little vague at that point too, but I do remember that I was working that day. I was an aircraft designer at the Curtiss Wright plant in Buffalo, New York. And we were working, and we heard the news then, and it was a shock because even at that time we were on a war footing schedule of working 7 days a week.
So the war has begun. Now, I'm just interested, why did each one of you decide to join? You know, what What was the motivation?
Well, in my case, I was airplane nuts when I was a kid, building model airplanes, and when I found out that they had decided, of course, this happened about a year later, but when I found out they were going to train black pilots, I volunteered, signed up, and was accepted and trained at Tuskegee, and the rest is history, I guess.
I was just interested in model aircraft flying, and I was saying, I want to join the Army Air Corps. I want to fly. I want to fly. And I was pestering my folks. I was too young. I couldn't get in. And it was only through persistence that they reluctantly signed me over so I could get into the Army Air Corps, and I passed the examination, was accepted. And the rest is history. I was in the Army Air Corps then, flying. So, of course, I feel great that I'm still here as a survivor and able to be present here and talk to you about my experience. But that was my feeling. I just wanted to fly.
Paul?
Well, I guess patriotism was a tradition in the family. My dad had quit college in 1915 to join the Army and was a signalman with Blackjack Pershing when they went down to Mexico after Pancho Villa. And then came up
That's a long one.
with Pershing, of course, when they put the expeditionary force together. So he was one of the first people to go over to France. And I grew up hearing about this constantly. We had his helmets on the wall and some of the artifacts. And he was a very ardent patriot, really. He lectured me constantly about the country and freedom and all of the rest of it. So when it happened, it was just natural that I would try to emulate it.
Major Gordon?
Yeah, I joined the Army because I wanted to be a soldier. I joined on the 4th of August, 1940, and I went down to 39 Whitehall Street, which is where the main recruiting station was at that time in the city. And I saw this big sign outside and Uncle Sam pointing, saying, "I want you." And on the back of it, it said the 15th Infantry, Tientsin, China. I said, that sounds tremendous, I'll go to China. I wanted to get out of New York City, by the way. And when I went to the recruiting sergeant, he didn't say anything about what later developed. Turned out we had no troops in Tientsin, China anymore, the 15th Infantry. They were gone. But the Army wasn't going to waste that little display they had. So he said, well, I can't send you to China, but how about the Philippines? I said, okay, where is the Philippines? And he told me it was near China. And that's how I got into the Army.
How old were you at the time?
I just turned 18.
Just turned 18.
And as I say, and I repeat it, I wanted to be a soldier. And if I could have gone to West Point, I would have gone there. But that wasn't meant to be.
Mrs. Jaffe?
I couldn't go in until I was 20, and I didn't think too much about it, except that members of my class, which was a class of 42 in high school, were dying, and I couldn't do anything about it. And we had about 6 of the young men that were in my class had died, 2 of them being the 2 smartest kids in our class. And I just felt very helpless. And I went down and I inquired and found that I wanted to go in for meteorology. That was something that I would have loved, still do, for the Air Corps, the Navy. And so I went in and I ended up in the medical corps. So what else is new?
Well, what was it like? Was this a difficult decision as a woman at that period? This is 1940. How did your parents react?
They were very, very angry. This was not what young women were supposed to do. And I had my brother in service, of course, and my 2 brothers-in-law. And I just felt that I would be able to go and maybe I could make a difference someplace, which, when you think about it, is kind of idiotic. Because one person in the Navy doesn't make any difference. But I decided on it, I thought about it, decided on it, and went ahead with it.
Ms. Lewis?
It was maybe the same with me, except I was going to join the Navy, but I went by the Marine recruiter and he grabbed me. I had no choice. You know how they work. No, I had two cousins that joined the Marine Corps just before me, who were very close. I was an only child, and I know it was hard on my folks because my dad was all Army. And when I came home and said I was in the Marines, I think he disowned me, but otherwise it was very,
okay.
Yeah, I know. That's why, and I knew I could be of some help, even if it was the secretarial end of it, you know, on the radio end.
Colonel Liberty?
When I graduated from nursing school, they allowed us to take state boards early, and they passed, if we passed, the Army took us because they were desperate for nurses. And I went in, and I went home and told my father what I had done, and he looked at me and he said, "Babe, I do not approve of this." And I said, "Well, it's done." He said, "You made your bed, you're going to lie in it." So I did, but just to get off on a sidetrack, when I got called back to Korea, I went in, he was in the hospital, and I went in, I did not want to go. And I went in and I said to him, "Daddy, I'm going to have to go back in the Army." And you know what he said? "My girl, I'm very proud of you. Be thankful that you have a career where you can help your country."
As I said before, I was working in an airplane plant at the time. And because of the job that I had what I think they call it a critical skills deferment. I think it was 2B or something like that. And I was not called up in the draft for about a year. By that time, most of my friends were gone, and I decided that I better go too, regardless of the deferment. I wanted to join the Navy, so I went to the recruiting office, and they said they didn't want to touch me with that deferment. And they said, "If you want to," he said, "go down to the next building here and talk to the recruiters at the Maritime Service and see what they say." So I went down there, and they didn't ask any questions at all. And so they signed me up, and I think it was within a week I had taken the physicals, and I was already shipped out to Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn, New York, which was the basic training school for the Maritime Service. My first experiences from there on, I could go in later.
Now, you've all joined, and you quickly find out that the service is different. Could you give us some idea of what your initial experiences were in basic training, how that was different from your civilian life? Colonel Dyer?
Well, you know, I've spoken to you before about my situation. When Air Corps told me to go home and wait because the base down at Tuskegee was still being built, I guess my draft board got kind of antsy because I think I was home about 3 or 4 months, and they were drafting people right and left. And so one day I got greetings. The older people know what greetings were from Uncle Sam. And next thing I knew, I was on the train on the way to Fort Niagara to the classification station, and I wound up in the field artillery. And I thought for sure that my hope of flying an airplane was lost. And I spent about 6 months in the field artillery before I was transferred down to Tuskegee for training.
John?
As I said, I wanted to fly. That's all that was on my mind. And they told me, "Yes, you're all set now. Go ahead and get your basic training." Sent me down to Greensboro, North Carolina, and that was my first experience of the South. And but the brief basic training, because they needed us, and I was sent to Bombardier School. They said, "That's where you're going." We started over there, and they pulled us out. And this is later in the war. I mean, that was when they needed you the most. You're going. The whole class was taken and sent to gunnery school. Well, that was still flying, and I went through different phases of the training with the crew and so forth, and it was a great experience with the crew. The oldest member of the crew was 22, and the others were teenagers. I was the baby of the crew. I was the youngest one, and they call me the baby here. But it was experience, and I can go on, but I'll just leave it at that, because after we got through our crew training, we were then given a short time off and then sent over to England. But it was an experience, an exciting experience, getting into the basic training. But the unfortunate aspect of the crew training and so forth, that before some of the crews got into combat, the plane crashes and training and so forth, we lost people there right in this country before they ever got off into combat. That was sad. And our first experience, we were sent to Batista Field, Cuba, and there we were doing a crew training, also observing any submarines that we'd have to call back and report any sightings of submarines in the Navy or whoever took over from there. Mm-hmm. And once we got through, we were then sent to England, and I'll stop right there.
Paul, your basic training experiences?
Well, first of all, I wonder if you've noticed, Michael, listening to each of us, how much serendipity has to do with what happens to you as far as how we got into the service and what happened afterward. Leading up to my going into the service, I was an avid news junkie. And I would listen to people like H.V. Kaltenborn and Gabriel Heater and all these news people telling about the war all around the world. I wanted to go single-handedly fight Adolf Hitler. You know, that was the whole thing. When I heard about Pearl Harbor, I don't even think I stopped to think about a Japanese person somewhere. I was going to go fight Hitler because we were in it. When I got in the service and they gave me tests and said I was best suited as a radio operator, and they sent us to radio school in Chicago. And Chicago is a great city to go to school in, I have to tell you. It had more bars per square foot than any city I'd ever seen. And naturally, when we weren't in the school, we took advantage of that. One day, and some of us were 1 foot from being kicked out of this school and back into the service where we belong, some brass came through and they said, this rumor went through and said, they're going to build this giant propaganda radio station on the top of the mark in San Francisco, and the best operators are going to be there. So we all studied our heads off. And of course what happened was we became the cadre for this first ever experimental unit that was going to lead everybody into the amphibious operations in the Pacific. So, you know, if we'd known that, I don't know if we had done it or not, but that's how it happened.
Major Gordon?
Yeah, when I joined the Army, as I mentioned earlier, the recruiting sergeant, I think he was a sergeant, he should have been, he was good. He convinced me to get on a subway, and he said, take this little piece of paper you have, present it to the subway toll taker, and he'll let you on the subway. And we went up to upstate, the city here in Yonkers, where we had a Fort Slocum, which was a big recruiting place tied into overseas shipment. And for the first time in my life, I discovered French toast. I had never seen nor heard of French toast, to say nothing of the food that they provided, which certainly coming out of the slums of New York City, we were never in any way experienced in that particular department. And clean sheets on the bed every night really took me by surprise. So from there, we weren't there 5 weeks. They put us on a ship in the Brooklyn Army base, September the 14th, 1940. And the food was great on the ship, except I was seasick all the time. I couldn't eat for 48 days. So when I got to the Philippines, I made up for it, though.
Now, I would imagine nursing basic training was a little different.
Well, I'll go back to the food. I was good Jewish girl, never ate non-kosher food until I went into the Navy. And I don't remember, went down to Hunter College, which was basic. Went to, I don't know what we had for dinner when we got down there from Albany. But the next morning we had bacon and eggs for breakfast, had Virginia baked ham for lunch, and pork chop for supper. And you know what? I still don't like pork products. But we did all the testing. We marched, and we marched, and we marched. And we were on macadam, or tar, rather, which tarred over the whole area in front of the reservoir there, and you marched on that in the middle of the summer, and it was hot. But we did it, and we went through ridiculous things, like when we had captain's inspection and somebody leaned out of, one of the inspectors leaned out of the window and checked the wall, the outside wall, to make sure that it wasn't dirty. It's really stupid things. But I did all the tests, the aptitude tests, and when I got called in, and here I'm looking for what I wanted in the Navy Air Corps, I was told that I had the highest marks that they had in mechanical abilities. Up to that point, anyway, coming through the testing. So therefore, they did the logical thing. They put me in the medical corps.
That's cute.
Ms. Lewis?
Yes, sure. Well, I can remember we were the second group to go through Camp Lejeune in
Second.
August. And I think we broke all the Olympic running records because you had to go around the barracks at 5:30 in the morning.
Yeah.
And the mosquitoes would try to beat us. It was hard, wasn't it? I know, no, it was, yeah, it was tough. And then the overseas training, when I went overseas, was even worse than the Marine Corps. We had to go over the sides of the ships and those cargo net things, and I'm short. I had a little problem with that. But
Goodness.
we made it, and I'm proud we did.
Now, you're from upstate New York originally?
Originally from Poughkeepsie?
Poughkeepsie?
Yes, sir.
What was the South like back in 1940?
Don't ask.
No, I had never been down there. It was hot, a lot of mosquitoes, that's all. We never got off base because somebody in our bunch was stealing, and you had weekends to go to the beach, but we never made it.
Oh, dear.
It was our own sergeant, believe it or not, yeah. Yeah.
Colonel Liberty?
Well, I went to Fort Dix, New Jersey. And I came from a very sheltered household. There were 6 girls, and my father made sure that nothing happened to any of us, if you know what I mean. He guarded us very well. And we went through basic training, we marched, we pitched tents, we went through the obstacle course, we went over water, swung over water on a rope. We climbed a fence, and I got short legs. I never made that fence. But I fell in the mud a lot. And then, when we marched, I was consistently out of step. And the sergeant gave me a 5-pound bag of rocks to carry in my left hand. I never forgot where my left leg was again. Then they sent us to Fort Patrick Henry, Virginia. We were going to go overseas. We were a small group, we were all young, but we were friends, we knew one another. And one night in the barracks, a sergeant comes in and he said, "Where's Lieutenant Liberty, Francis Liberty?" And I stood up and I said, "That's me." He said, "Get your gear together, you're going with the 86th, the Texas unit. You're a surgical nurse." So I went. The next day we're going on board ship. Now, we got 60 pounds of medical supplies on our back, plus a duffel bag and a helmet. Now, whoever invented those helmets was cruel. They hurt. Anyway, we got up aboard, and you give your name, your rank, and your serial number. So I got up there and I said, "Liberty, Francis M., Lieutenant, N799517. The guy looked at me and he said, "Oh my God, you're a woman." They spelled my first name wrong. There were 2 of us. Her name was Miriam. And you know how I went overseas? It was 4 bunks in a cabin, and they slung a hammock between it. There were 4 people in that cabin that were seasick, and I wasn't one of them. So I spent most of the time on deck. And the first night we went up on deck, this other girl and I, we were transported by merchant marines. And this was Liberty ships, and he said to me, you have to be very quiet, and you can't move and make a lot of noise. We're in convoy. The next night, when we got up, we damn near froze to death the first night. The next night, when we got up there, behind the gun emplacements were pillows and blankets for us. That's it.
Mr. Scheisel, what was the Merchant Marine training like?
It was a shock. It was nothing like I expected, but once I hit Sheepshead Bay, it was a basic boot camp type of affair, very similar to the Navy. I was assigned, they had companies of 100 men there, and we were given our usual daily dose of marching, swimming, lifeboat drills, gunnery practice, and specialized training, whichever department you were going to go in. I was a budding engineer, but I wanted to go in the deck department, so they politely put me in the steward's department, which makes a lot of sense. And that was the shortest course of the bunch, and within 3 months I was assigned to my first ship, which was an old tanker. And I was given the very high position of a utility man in the galley, and I never want to see a dirty pot again in my life, because I was on that ship for 6.5 months before I came back. But the advantage of being in the Merchant Marine is when you come back on a trip like that, you can say thank you and goodbye. And I was not signed up for the duration or anything like that. But when I said thank you to the Maritime Service and goodbye, they said, no, you're not leaving. We will give you a test for officer school. So I passed the test for Kings Point, which was a 2-year program. I passed the test for radio school, which was a 6-month program, and I opted for that. And I sailed the rest of my career as a radio officer.